In a limestone building on Water Street in Kerrville, Texas, there was a ledger book. It recorded every transaction that passed through Charles Schreiner's general store from 1869 onward. Wool purchased at prices Schreiner set. Supplies sold at prices Schreiner set. Loans extended at interest rates Schreiner set. The ledger was meticulous. Every rancher's name entered in careful copperplate. Every dollar owed, every acre pledged as collateral. Every year the balance grew larger, and the land quietly changed hands. The collateral was recorded in copperplate. Kerrville sat in the Texas hill country, limestone canyons and cedar breaks stretching in every direction. A hard country, a country where drought arrived without warning and stayed for years. A country where cash was so scarce that most men conducted their entire lives on credit. By 1890, that credit ran through one man, one store, one ledger. Charles Schreiner had arrived in Texas as a child, speaking no English, owning nothing. 40 years later, he held the mortgages on more hill country land than any other single person in the state. The banker, the wool buyer, the merchant, the landlord. Every transaction in Kerr County rolled into one. By the time Charles Schreiner was done, he owned the store, the bank, the wool price, and the land under your feet. Did this make him a pioneer or a landlord who never paid for the territory? Chapter 1. 20,000 Sheep and a Hard Country. The Texas hill country is not hill-hospitable ground. The Balcones, escarpment divides central Texas into two distinct worlds. To the east, black clay soil and reliable rainfall. To the west, limestone karst, cedar and live oak, and a brutality of climate that punishes optimism. The hill country sits in that western world, a region of thin soil and violent weather where rivers run bone dry in August and flood in October. Summer heat routinely topped 110 degrees. Drought years stripped the cedar hillsides to bare rock. Even good years required constant, exhausting work from every person on a ranch. The country rewarded endurance and punished debt. The Comanche had known this country best. For 2 centuries they controlled the southern plains and the hill country margins with extraordinary skill, adapting to an environment that defeated other peoples. Their raiding economy extended deep into Mexican Texas and then American Texas. The frontier settlements established by German immigrants in the 1840s and 50s existed in genuine daily terror of mounted raids. Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, Comfort, Kerrville, all founded under conditions that required armed men on regular patrol, that required neighbors who would ride toward gunfire rather than away from it. The immigration wave that shaped the hill country arrived between 1844 and 1860. The Adelsverein, a colonization society backed by German nobles, organized the initial settlements. The settlers who came were not destitute peasants. Many were educated, politically liberal, fleeing the failed revolutions of 1848. They brought skills, masonry, carpentry, farming technique, but arrived into conditions no European background had prepared them for. The land was different, the seasons were wrong, the dangers were unlike anything they had faced. They built in limestone because limestone was everywhere. The hill country sits on the Edwards Plateau, a formation of Cretaceous rock that erodes into blocks almost ready for construction. German settlers quarried it from hillsides and creek beds, fitted it without mortar in some cases, and built structures that still stand today. The villages they founded looked strange in the Texas landscape. Orderly streets, solid masonry, Sunday concerts, but they functioned. What they could not build was a financial infrastructure. The hill country economy in the 1860s and 70s ran almost entirely on barter and credit. Cash was something men saw in San Antonio if they made the trip. Most transactions were promises written in ledgers or remembered between neighbors. Wool and cattle were the two products a man could convert to actual money, but converting them required getting them to market, which required cash for the drive, which required credit. The system ate itself in circles. A rancher needed supplies to get through winter. He bought on credit. He needed to sell his wool clip to pay the credit. He sold the wool at whatever price the buyer offered, because the buyer was also the creditor, and refusing meant calling the loan. The loan could not be paid. The land served as collateral. This was not unique to the hill country. Crop lien systems operated across the post-Civil War South on identical principles, trapping sharecroppers in cycles of debt that functioned like a second slavery. The hill country version ran through a general store rather than a cotton factor, through sheep ranchers rather than cotton farmers. The mechanism was the same. The man who controlled the credit controlled everything that flowed from it. In 1869, Charles Schreiner opened his general store in Kerrville. He was 30 years old. He had been in Texas for 17 years. He understood the land, the people, and the system better than almost anyone in the county. He was about to prove it. Chapter 2. The Ranger Who Learned the Country. Charles Armand Schreiner was born in the Alsace region of France in 1838, in a village near the Rhine River. His family was German-speaking, as most Alsatian families were, caught in the perpetual border dispute between France and the German states that would not resolve itself until Bismarck settled it by force in 1871. The Schreiners were Catholic, middle class, neither wealthy nor destitute. When the family emigrated to Texas in 1852, Charles was 14 years old. They settled near San Antonio, then moved into the hill country as German settlements expanded west. Schreiner grew up speaking German, learning Spanish from Mexican neighbors, acquiring English in the rough schools of frontier Texas. By the time he was 18, he was trilingual in a region where language was power. He could negotiate with Anglo ranchers, with German settlers, with Mexican traders. He could read contracts that others had to take on faith. He joined the Texas Rangers in 1861, just as the Civil War began. The Rangers during this period were not a romantic institution. They were a paramilitary force organized to protect white settlements from Comanche and Kiowa raiding, which intensified dramatically when Confederate Texas withdrew federal troops from frontier forts. Schreiner served in a ranger company operating out of the hill country, riding patrol between Kerrville and the upper Guadalupe River Valley. The work was brutal and dangerous. Men in his company were killed. He survived 6 years of it. What the ranger years gave Schreiner was geography. He rode every canyon and creek drainage in Kerr County. He knew which ranches lay where, which springs ran year-round, which routes connected settlements to San Antonio. He knew which families had arrived when, what they had built, what they still lacked. He saw the land not as an outsider, but as a man who had patrolled every inch of it on horseback in every season, under every condition. He also saw, with a clarity that came from that intimate knowledge, exactly what was missing. There was no reliable source of goods, no local credit, no wool buyer who paid fairly and didn't require a long trip to San Antonio, no one who could advance cash against a coming wool clip. He saw the gap. He understood that whoever filled it would control the county. In 1869, he mustered out of the Rangers, pooled whatever capital he had accumulated, and opened Charles Schreiner and Company on Water Street. The store sold everything a rancher needed: flour and coffee, hardware and rope, saddles and boots, seed, and medicine. He extended credit from the first day. He had to. Almost no one had cash. The credit was the product. Within 2 years, he was also buying wool. Chapter 3. The Store That Was Everything. Charles Schreiner and Company occupied a modest limestone building in a town of fewer than 500 people. The inventory was practical: canned goods, dry goods, hardware, ammunition, medicines of uncertain efficacy. The prices were fair enough to keep customers coming, high enough to sustain the credit risk Schreiner was absorbing. Every transaction was recorded. Every name in the ledger was a relationship he intended to maintain indefinitely. The structure he built was elegant in its simplicity. A rancher arrived in Kerrville needing supplies for the coming season. He had no cash. Schreiner extended credit against the value of his coming wool clip or cattle sale. The rancher bought his supplies, returned to his ranch, raised his sheep through the winter. When shearing season came in spring, he brought his wool to Kerrville. He sold it to Schreiner, who paid the price Schreiner had set. The proceeds went against the debt in the ledger. Whatever remained, if anything remained, was the rancher's margin for the year. The system required the rancher to come back. They always came back. There was nowhere else to go. San Antonio sat 100 miles east over rough roads. The trip required 3 days each way. A man could not make that journey 4 times a year for supplies and still run a ranch. Kerrville was the only viable market within a day's ride. Schreiner was Kerrville's only merchant of scale. The monopoly was not legal, not enforced by any authority, not the product of conspiracy. It was the product of geography and capital. He had arrived first, extended credit when no one else would, and built relationships that no competitor could easily break. He understood something fundamental about frontier credit. The goal was not to call the loan. The goal was to maintain the relationship long enough that the rancher's land and labor effectively worked for Schreiner's benefit indefinitely. A foreclosed ranch required management. A going concern managed by a loyal debtor generated both revenue and loyalty. Schreiner was patient. The ledger grew. The relationships deepened. By 1875, he was the largest wool buyer in the hill country. By 1880, he was financing cattle drives to Kansas railheads, advancing cash to ranchers who needed to move herds north, and collecting repayment on their return. The store was no longer just a store. It was a bank, a commodity exchange, a land title office, and a labor market simultaneously. All of it ran through one ledger. All of it answered to Charles Schreiner. Chapter 4. The Wool and the Cattle. Texas wool production exploded after the Civil War. The war had destroyed much of the South's agricultural economy and disrupted supply chains across every commodity market. In the recovery years, sheep ranching on the Edwards Plateau became genuinely profitable. The hill country climate, dry air, limestone grasses, reliable springs produced wool of high quality. Merino sheep, introduced by German settlers, thrived in the cedar breaks. Angora goats followed, producing mohair that found ready markets in eastern mills. For roughly 2 decades between the late 1860s and the late 80s, a man who ran sheep in Kerr County could build a decent life. Schreiner positioned himself at the center of this boom with precision. He was not simply a local buyer. He established direct relationships with wool commission merchants in San Antonio, and ultimately with buyers in Philadelphia and Boston, the twin centers of the American wool trade. When a hill country rancher sold his clip to Schreiner, that wool moved east through a chain Schreiner had built and controlled. The markup at each stage belonged to Schreiner. The rancher saw only the price offered at the Kerrville loading dock. The cattle trade worked differently but served the same function. The great trail drives of the 1870s and 80s moved Texas longhorns north to Kansas railheads at Abilene and Dodge City. A rancher with 500 head needed cash for drovers, for supplies, for the 2-month trip north. Schreiner advanced that cash. When the herd sold at the railhead, the advance plus interest came back to Kerrville. The rancher kept the remainder. In good years, the remainder was substantial. In bad years, when cattle prices fell or drought reduced the herd, the advance came due against collateral. The collateral was land. These were not predatory loans by the standards of the time. Schreiner charged rates competitive with any credit available in frontier Texas. The problem was not the rate. The problem was structural. When the only available credit comes from the only available buyer of your product, negotiation is theater. The rancher could accept Schreiner's terms or produce nothing. Most accepted the terms and understood implicitly that accepting them again next year was not optional. In 1879, Schreiner shipped over 1 million pounds of wool from Kerrville. In 1885, the figure exceeded 2 million. He was moving product through a territory that extended well beyond Kerr County, drawing ranchers from Kimball and Edwards and Real counties into his credit network across a 100-mile radius. The store on Water Street was the hub. Everything fed into it. The scale of the operation required capital beyond what any frontier merchant normally commanded, and Schreiner had sources his customers did not. He borrowed from San Antonio banks at rates unavailable to ranchers and lent at rates that generated the spread. Every link in the chain was legal. Every link worked in the same direction. Chapter 5. The Ledger as Land Deed. The foreclosures were not sudden. They accumulated over years, one bad season at a time. Drought came to the hill country in cycles. The 1880s brought several severe dry years in sequence. Sheep died, wool clips fell, cattle drives turned unprofitable when herds arrived thin at Kansas railheads. Ranchers who had borrowed through good years found their ledger balances growing faster than their ability to pay. The interest compounded. The debt exceeded the value of the annual clip. The land stood as collateral, and eventually the land transferred. Schreiner did not seize land eagerly. The records suggest genuine willingness to extend terms, to restructure debt, to carry ranchers through difficult years when he judged the relationship worth preserving. He was not a simple predator. He was something more complicated, a man who built a system that concentrated wealth in his hands regardless of his individual intentions, because the system's mathematics worked in only one direction. Every extension of credit increased indebtedness. Every bad year reduced the rancher's equity. Every foreclosure added acreage to Schreiner's holdings. The goodwill and the accumulation were not opposites. They were the same motion, seen from different distances. By 1885, Schreiner owned approximately 65,000 acres in Kerr County. By 1895, that figure had grown past 200,000. By 1900, he held more than 500,000 acres, stretching across multiple counties, land that had, 20 years earlier, belonged to dozens of independent ranching families. The transfer was legal. The documentation was meticulous. The ledger proved every step. The property he assembled became the Y.O. Ranch, named for a cattle brand Schreiner had registered in the 1870s. Its headquarters sat near the headwaters of the North Fork of the Guadalupe River, a limestone canyon country of striking beauty, cedar and live oak on the slopes, clear water in the creek bed, white-tailed deer moving through the brush at dusk. Schreiner built working infrastructure as the ranch grew. corrals and shearing pens, a headquarters complex of limestone buildings, water systems tapping the springs that Comanche riders had known for centuries. The ranch functioned as a coherent agricultural operation, not an assembled portfolio of random parcels. He invested in breeding stock. He maintained the water systems. He rode the land and knew it. This is where the story resists easy moral categories. The land Schreiner assembled was, in most cases, productive under his management in ways it had not been under fragmented ownership. The displacement and the development are not easy to separate, but they are also not the same thing, and the people who lost that land lost something real and irreplaceable. What they lost it to was also real. The contradictions do not cancel each other. They compound. Chapter 6. The Men Who Owed Him. The ledger recorded names. Behind the names were lives. Friedrich Baumgartner arrived in the Hill Country in 1863, one of thousands of German immigrants who came before and after him. He built a small ranch on Cypress Creek, running a few hundred sheep and a modest cattle herd. He borrowed from Schreiner in 1872 to expand his flock. The loan was reasonable. The interest was manageable. 3 bad wool years in a row between 1875 and 78 changed the arithmetic. The debt grew. The ranch transferred to Schreiner's ownership in 1880. Baumgartner stayed on as a tenant rancher for several years before moving to San Antonio. He is not in any local history. Jose Maria Longoria's family had ranched in the Hill Country since before Texas statehood, one of the Tejano families whose land grants predated Anglo settlement by generations. The disruptions of the Civil War and Reconstruction eroded their legal position, in ways that were also not accidental, not random, but the product of deliberate dispossession across the entire Southwest. The Longorias appear in Schreiner's ledger in the 1870s, buying supplies and selling wool. By 1885, their land is recorded in Schreiner's holdings. The family did not disappear from Kerr County. Tejano families remained as workers and tenants, but their position as landowners ended. This pattern repeated across the Hill Country with a consistency that suggests systemic pressure rather than individual misfortune. The Mexican shepherds occupied the hardest position in the entire system. Schreiner employed pastores, Mexican sheep herders, on his expanding landholdings throughout the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. These men tended flocks in remote pastures, living in minimal shelter, often with no transportation and no independent access to supplies. Many were paid in scrip, redeemable only at Schreiner's store. This was standard practice across extractive industries in late 19th century America, from coal mines to lumber camps to cattle ranches. It was also, by design, a mechanism for retaining labor. A man paid in scrip that only spent at one store cannot easily leave for another employer. His wages returned to his employer's ledger. The pastores who tended Schreiner's sheep in the Cedar Hills had come from Mexico, from South Texas, from communities with no other economic options. They worked in isolation, often separated from their families for months at a stretch. The wool they gathered, the lambs they protected through hard winters, the water they hauled to distant tanks, this labor made the YO Ranch productive. Schreiner paid competitive wages by the standards of the era. He fed his workers. There is no evidence of the violent labor discipline that characterized some large Western ranching operations. These qualifications matter. They do not change the structural fact that the scrip system bound men to his employ through economic compulsion rather than voluntary labor markets. He understood exactly how it worked. He had designed it this way. The brilliance of the operation and the exploitation of the workforce were not separate features of Charles Schreiner and Company. They were the same architecture, seen from opposite sides of the counter. The names of the pastories are not on the plaques in Kerrville. They are in the ledger. That is all. Chapter 7. The Bank. In 1895, Charles Schreiner formalized what had been operating informally for 25 years. He incorporated the Schreiner Bank. The store had functioned as a bank since 1869. Credit extension, interest charges, accounts maintained across years and decades, these were banking functions performed without a banking charter. The formalization reflected both the growth of the operation and the changing regulatory environment of the Gilded Age, when state banking commissions began requiring institutional structure for what had previously been handled by handshake and reputation. Schreiner filed the paperwork and received his charter. The sign changed. The ledger system did not. The bank occupied a new limestone building on Water Street, 2 stories of dressed stone with a pressed tin ceiling and a heavy iron vault door. The building announced permanence. Kerrville had grown substantially since 1869. The railroad arrived in 1887, linking the hill country to San Antonio and the broader Texas economy for the first time, and the town's architecture reflected new ambitions. Schreiner's bank building was among the most substantial structures in town. This was intentional. A vault door communicates something that a store counter cannot. The bank expanded the credit network beyond Schreiner's personal relationships. It could accept deposits from the community, lend against land and stock, issue instruments that moved through San Antonio correspondents to national money markets. The system that had operated through one man's judgment and one ledger now had institutional form. It could outlast Schreiner himself, and it did. The railroad changed Schreiner's position in ways both threatening and advantageous. For the first time, outside merchants could ship goods to Kerrville competitively. The store's monopoly on supply eroded somewhat, but the railroad also made his commodity operations more efficient. Cattle drives to Kansas ended. Herds loaded directly in Kerrville for San Antonio and beyond. Wool moved east in boxcars instead of freight wagons. The transportation improvement served his business at least as much as it served any competitor. He adapted. The store remained the largest in the county. The bank became the primary financial institution. The land holdings continued to grow. By 1900, the operation was diversified enough that no single disruption could threaten the whole structure. He had built redundancy into the system over 30 years of careful accumulation, a man who arrived in Texas at 14, speaking no English, owning nothing. Now sitting behind a vault door on Water Street while ranchers waited to discuss their accounts. The transformation was extraordinary by any measure. What it required, and who paid for it, is the part the commemorations prefer not to address. Chapter 8. A Palace in Limestone. By 1900, Charles Schreiner was 62 years old and among the wealthiest men in Texas. He had spent 30 years building the economic infrastructure of Kerr County. Now he built the physical marker of his position. The house he constructed on a prominent lot in Kerrville was not ostentatious by Eastern standards. He was not Marjorie Post. He did not import Dorian stone from Genoa or commission theatrical designers from New York opera houses. He was a German immigrant who had grown up on a frontier, and his aesthetic remained practical even at its most formal. But by the standards of the hill country, the house said something precise about the county's power structure. The structure rose 2 stories in dressed limestone with a wide veranda wrapping the front and sides, elaborate millwork on the porch columns, and rooms arranged to accommodate the formal entertaining that marked a Gilded Age businessman's social obligations. The interior featured walnut woodwork, imported wallpaper, a parlor designed to receive guests whose own homes were functional limestone farmhouses. The contrast was deliberate. When a rancher came to Kerrville to discuss his account, he met Schreiner in a setting designed to communicate exactly who held the advantaged position in that conversation. The YO Ranch headquarters told the same story at a different scale. By 1900, the ranch employed dozens of workers and required a small village's worth of infrastructure. Limestone bunkhouses, a commissary, corrals, and shearing pens of substantial construction, a ranch manager's house that was itself comfortable by frontier standards. The headquarters sat in a creek valley with water year-round, cedar hillsides rising on both sides, a practical location that was also genuinely beautiful. Schreiner was not an absentee owner managing from a city office. He rode the ranch, knew his foreman by name, tracked stock numbers with the same precision he applied to the store ledger. This is part of what makes the Schreiner story resistant to easy reading. He was not a remote financial predator who stripped land and left. He built a working institution on what he acquired. The YO Ranch, under his management and under the management of his descendants, became one of the significant ranching operations in Texas history. It persists today, reduced from its peak of over 600,000 acres to something closer to 40,000, but still operating, still carrying the brand. The transformation of other men's land into his own was total. So was his commitment to what he built from it. The limestone house in Kerrville still stands. It is a historical landmark now. Visitors photograph the veranda and read the interpretive signs. The signs do not mention the ledger. Chapter 9. The Interlocking System. Charles Schreiner's operation by 1900 was a single, interlocking structure that defies the usual categories of business history. He was not a banker who occasionally sold goods, not a merchant who extended credit on the side, not a rancher who had also built a store. He was all of these simultaneously, in a configuration where each element reinforced the others to a degree that made the whole far greater than any part. The store generated information about who owed what and who was struggling. The wool-buying operation gave him leverage over ranchers at the moment of their greatest dependence. The bank converted informal credit relationships into legal instruments. The land holdings gave him collateral, against which he could borrow from San Antonio institutions at rates his customers could not access. The railroad connections moved product efficiently, and the civic leadership, church deacon, county committeeman, civic benefactor, created social obligations that made default feel like a betrayal of community rather than a simple business failure. The figures from the peak years are difficult to reconstruct precisely, but the shape is clear. The store moved hundreds of thousands of dollars in goods annually at a time when a working rancher's annual cash income might total a few $100s. The wool operation processed millions of pounds per year. The bank held notes on land across multiple counties. The YO Ranch ran tens of thousands of sheep and cattle on over 500,000 acres. All of this answered to one man, one family, one ledger tradition that had started with a limestone building and a list of men who needed flour on credit. The ranching families who made up Schreiner's customer base in 1870 often held between 500 and 5,000 acres, land enough to sustain a family in modest but real independence. By 1900, many of those families had been absorbed into Schreiner's holdings, their former owners working as tenants or foremen on land that had been their own. Some had left entirely, moving to San Antonio or Fort Worth in search of wage work. Their children grew up in cities, disconnected from the land their parents had ranched. This displacement appears in probate records, deed transfers, and census data as a slow shift in the ownership column. Names that appear as landowners in 1870 appear as laborers in 1890. Names present in 1890 are absent entirely by 1910. The ledger recorded each transaction individually. Seen whole across 5 decades, it recorded a transformation of land tenure that reshaped who Kerr County was, who owned it, who worked it, and who had any standing to call it theirs. Chapter 10. What the Monument Forgets. Charles Schreiner died on August 12, 1927. He was 88 years old. He had outlived most of the men whose land filled his ledger, outlived several of his own children, outlived the cattle drive era, the frontier period, and the first generation of hill country settlement entire. He died wealthy and respected, surrounded by family, in the limestone house in Kerrville. The town mourned genuinely. Whatever else Schreiner had been, he had also been the man who kept the county supplied through hard times, who advanced credit when no one else would, who employed dozens of workers and paid them reliably, who contributed to the church and the civic organizations and the institutions that gave Kerrville its shape. The grief was real. The admiration was real. None of it was false. It sat alongside other things that were equally real. The memorials accumulated. Schreiner University was founded in 1923 through a gift Schreiner made to establish a Presbyterian preparatory school. It became a college after the Second World War and a university in 2001. It enrolls roughly 1,200 students today and occupies a campus of genuine beauty on the Guadalupe River. The Schreiner name appears on every building of consequence. His portrait hangs in the administration building. The official history describes a generous benefactor who gave Kerrville the gift of education. The Schreiner Bank name persisted through 20th century consolidations into the 2000s. The original limestone building on Water Street still stands. The Captain's House, as the family residence was sometimes called, carries a Texas Historical Landmark designation. The marker tells the story of an immigrant who built a business empire through hard work and vision. This is accurate. It is not complete. The ranching families who lost their land to Schreiner's ledger are not on the markers. The pastores who tended his flocks on Scrip wages are not in the university history. The Tejano families, whose land grants dissolved into his holdings, are not in the official account. Friedrich Baumgartner, who borrowed in good faith in 1872 and lost his ranch 8 years later, is not commemorated anywhere in Kerrville. He is in the ledger. That is all. This is not unusual. The 19th century American West produced dozens of men who assembled land empires through identical mechanisms, and the memorials they left behind uniformly celebrate the vision and omit the method. But the vision and the method were inseparable. You cannot honor the university without acknowledging that the money came from somewhere, that the accumulated capital required accumulated land, that the land transfers required a system in which one man held every lever simultaneously: the supply of goods, the price of wool, the terms of credit, and the decision of when to foreclose. The celebration and the erasure are not separate decisions made by separate people at separate times. They are the same decision, made once and then inherited. Chapter 11. The Scrip Economy. There was a currency in Kerr County that only worked in one place. It was printed on paper issued by Charles Schreiner and Company and redeemable for goods at the store on Water Street. It was not legal tender. It could not pay a tax bill or settle a debt at any other establishment. It could buy flour, coffee, rope, medicine, boots, anything the store stocked, and nothing else. The men who received it as wages could spend it or hold it. Those were the only options. Store scrip was not an invention of Charles Schreiner. By the 1880s, it had become a standard mechanism of labor control across the industrial United States. Coal companies in West Virginia paid miners in scrip, redeemable only at company stores. Timber operations in the Pacific Northwest used the same system. Cotton planters across the South ran commissaries that functioned identically. The National Labor Relations Act would eventually prohibit the practice, but that law would not arrive until 1935. For 50 years before it, scrip was legal, common, and deliberately designed. Schreiner's pastorers, the Mexican sheep herders who worked his expanding land holdings, received their wages in a combination of cash and scrip. The exact ratio varied by worker, by season, by the foreman running a particular pasture. No comprehensive payroll record has survived to document the full picture. What the surviving accounts show is that scrip constituted a significant portion of compensation throughout the 1880s and 90s, and that the store stocked everything a man in a remote hill country pasture needed to survive. The design required no explanation. A pastor working a distant range had no transportation of his own, no means to reach San Antonio or any competing supplier, no practical way to convert scrip into cash without traveling to Kerrville, where only Schreiner's establishment would accept it. He could save scrip against a future purchase. He could spend it at the store. He could not invest it, send it to family in Mexico, or use it to build any kind of economic independence from the man who had issued it. The labor market for sheep herders in the hill country was not without alternatives. Other ranchers needed pastores. The Edwards Plateau was sheep country from the Pecos River east to the Pedernales. A skilled herder who knew the Cedar Hills, who could read weather and water, and the behavioral signals of a flock moving toward distress, was a man with genuine worth in that economy. Scrip wages did not prevent him from seeking better terms elsewhere in theory. In practice, the scrip he held represented his earned wages, and leaving meant abandoning them. It was not imprisonment. It was economic entrapment, which achieves the same result through subtler means and leaves no marks. This is documented territory. Historians of the post-Civil War West have traced the scrip system across dozens of industries and hundreds of individual operations. The hill country version followed the template precisely. Schreiner did not design something novel. He implemented something proven in a location and among a workforce where it would work with minimal resistance. The pastorers who tended his flocks also lived in conditions that reflected their position in the system. Jacales, brush shelters, at remote range stations, minimal furnishings, food supplies issued from the store ledger against their wages, weeks at a time without contact with family or community. The work was skilled, but the conditions were not. Caring for a flock required knowledge accumulated over years, reading terrain for water, anticipating predator pressure, managing a herd's movement through drought conditions without losing weight on the animals. This knowledge took years to build. The conditions under which it was exercised took no time at all to understand. The scrip economy intersected with the land and credit economy in one further way. A pastor who worked on a rancher's land before that rancher defaulted on a Schreiner loan found himself, after the transfer, working for Schreiner on what had been his employer's property. His labor continued. His conditions changed little. The ownership of the land above him had shifted entirely. He likely received no explanation. The ledger simply recorded the transfer and moved on. Chapter 12. The Drought That Broke the County. 1886 opened dry and grew drier. The hill country rain gauge at Kerrville, which Schreiner maintained, recorded less than 12 inches for the year. The long-term average ran closer to 30 inches. Springs that had run year-round through 2 decades of settlement slowed to seeps, then stopped. The Guadalupe River dropped to a trickle in August. Grass that normally grew knee-high on flat pastures came up ankle-high and yellow by June and stopped entirely by July. Sheep are not cattle. They can survive on terrain that would starve a cow. They can find forage on rocky slopes, browse cedar brush, and extract moisture from vegetation that other livestock ignore. But they need water, and they need grass enough to hold condition through the year and lamb successfully in spring. 1886 gave them neither. Flocks that had numbered 1,000 head entering the year came through it at 600, 700. The losses fell entirely on the rancher. The loan did not shrink with the flock. 1887 was slightly better. 1888 was worse. 3 consecutive bad years operating on thin margins, borrowed against coming wool clips that came in light, was enough to break the arithmetic for the smaller operations. The men who had borrowed modestly in good years, who had managed their accounts carefully, who had every intention of paying, found their balances growing despite their best efforts. Interest compounded monthly. A note that had been manageable in 84 was impossible by 88. Schreiner's ledger from this period, the portions that survive in fragments in the Schreiner collection at the Center for American History in Austin, shows account after account moving from current to delinquent between 85 and 90. Names that appear as regular customers through the early 80s begin carrying larger and larger balances. Notations in the margins suggest renegotiated terms, extended deadlines, and restructured debt. He was not calling loans at the first sign of distress. He was absorbing the drought alongside his customers, extending the relationship as long as the underlying collateral held value. The collateral was land. The land held value throughout. He could afford patience. The transfers concentrated in 1889 through 93. Deed records at the Kerr County Courthouse show a sharp increase in transactions conveying land from individual ranchers to Charles Schreiner during this 5-year window. Not all of these were foreclosures in the strict legal sense. Some were negotiated sales, a rancher who could see the end coming, who chose to sell voluntarily rather than default and lose the property in court, receiving somewhat better terms for his cooperation. The distinction matters legally. It matters less to the family that no longer owns the land. Several dozen operations in Kerr County alone transferred during this period. The figure across Kimball, Edwards, and Real counties brings the total considerably higher. Each transfer was individually legal, individually documented, individually the product of a specific credit relationship that had run its course. Seen individually, each one looked like an unfortunate outcome of bad weather and thin margins. Seen as a whole, the drought years look like the mechanism that converted 50 years of patient credit extension into one of the largest private land accumulations in Texas history. By 1893, when the rains returned and the grass came back and wool prices stabilized, the Kerr County land map had changed. The families that weathered the drought years and came through with their land intact were either Schreiner's largest and most credit-worthy customers, the ones he had every reason to protect, or the ones who had managed without his credit at all. Everyone in between had been absorbed. The drought did not cause this outcome. It accelerated it. The structural conditions that made it possible had been in place since 1869. All the drought did was compress the timeline. Chapter 13, The Man Across the Counter. Joseph Faust arrived in Kerr County from Gillespie County in 1874 with 160 acres he had purchased under the Texas land grant system, 300 sheep, a wife named Katharina, and 2 small children. He was 29 years old. He spoke German at home and broken English in town. He was not wealthy, but he was not desperate. A small landholder with enough animals to build something over time if the seasons cooperated. His account at Schreiner's opened in 1875. The first purchases were household goods, coffee, salt, cloth, a cast-iron skillet, small amounts. He paid in cash when he could, in credit when he couldn't, and the balance stayed manageable through the late 70s. By 1880, he had expanded his flock to 800 head and borrowed more substantially against the coming wool clip. The clip came in at 60 cents a pound, a good price for the time. He paid down the balance. He was doing what the credit system was theoretically designed to allow, borrowing to grow, repaying from production, building equity over time. The drought hit him in 86 with the rest of the county. He lost nearly 200 animals in the first year. His clip in 87 was a third of 85's yield. His account balance grew. Schreiner's men restructured the note twice, in 87 and again in 88. By 89, Joseph Faust owed more than his land was worth on the open market. He sold in March of 1890. The deed conveyance at the Kerr County Courthouse records the transaction in 4 lines. 160 acres on the South Fork of Town Creek, conveyed by Joseph and Katerina Faust to Charles Schreiner for the sum of $340 and satisfaction of outstanding debt. The $340 settled the difference between what the land was valued at and what was owed. He received it. He took his family and what remained of his flock and moved to a rented place 2 counties east. The record ends there. What happened to Joseph Faust after March 1890 is not in any document accessible today. His children do not appear in subsequent Kerr County records. He did not return to purchase land in the hill country during the recovery years of the 90s, when prices were low enough that a man with modest savings might have re-entered the market. Either he lacked the savings, or he stayed away, or he died before the opportunity arose. The record doesn't say. The land stayed in Schreiner's holdings, folded into the Wyo Ranch, grazed by sheep through the 1890s and cattle into the 20th century. Texas law required a wife's signature on land conveyances, a provision designed to protect women's homestead interests, not that it protected hers. She signed. The land transferred. Her name does not appear in the commemorative record of Kerr County settlement. The Fausts are not a special case. They are an ordinary one. Multiply them by 40 in Kerr County alone. Multiply them by however many hundreds across the broader credit network Schreiner maintained into adjacent counties. The individual stories are ordinary. The aggregate is a transformation of land tenure that reshaped who the hill country belonged to, conducted one legal transaction at a time, across a generation. Chapter 14. The railroad changes everything except the important things. The Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway reached Kerrville on April 13, 1887. The town celebrated. A brass band played at the depot. Schreiner stood near the platform with the mayor and the county judge, watching the locomotive arrive. The railroad meant the hill country was no longer isolated. Supplies would move faster, at lower cost, more reliably than the freight wagon system that had connected Kerrville to San Antonio since the town's founding. Cattle could load at the Kerrville depot rather than walking to the railhead. Wool could move east in boxcars rather than freight wagons. The distance to market, measured in time and cost, contracted dramatically on the day the tracks arrived. What the railroad did not change was the structure of credit. The merchants and bankers in San Antonio, who might theoretically have used rail access to extend their operations into Kerrville, faced an immediate problem. Schreiner had 20 years of established relationships, an intimate knowledge of every customer's land and animals and financial history, and a monopoly on the trust that frontier credit requires. A San Antonio bank could open a Kerrville branch. It could not instantly know that Friedrich Baumgartner's North Pasture Spring ran dry 2 years out of 5, or that Jose Longoria's wool clip ran lighter than his flock numbers suggested because he ran more ewes than wethers. This knowledge took decades to accumulate. It lived in Schreiner's head and in his ledger. It was not transferable. The railroad also arrived at a moment when Schreiner's operation was diversifying away from pure dependence on the store. The bank charter was 8 years away, but the informal banking function had already grown large enough that goods retail represented a declining share of total revenue. By the time competition in the dry goods market arrived via rail, and it did arrive, with San Antonio wholesalers shipping goods to smaller Kerrville merchants, Schreiner had already repositioned. He was not primarily a merchant by the early 1890s. He was primarily a landowner, a lender, and a commodity buyer. The store continued operating profitably, but it had become one element of a much larger structure rather than the structure itself. The railroad's most significant effect on Schreiner's operations was logistical. It accelerated wool shipments east. It reduced the cost of supplies he purchased for the YO Ranch. It made communication with San Antonio banking correspondents faster. Every efficiency that the railroad introduced, it introduced equally to Schreiner and to his customers, but the customers operated at the margin of viability, where efficiency gains were absorbed by debt service, while Schreiner operated well above the margin, where gains compounded into further advantage. This is the pattern that defines concentrated economic power. Not that it prevents others from improving their position, but that improvements flow more efficiently through the concentrated node than through the distributed ones. The railroad made everyone in Kerr County better off in absolute terms. It made the gap between Schreiner and everyone else wider in relative terms. Both things were true simultaneously. Kerrville grew visibly in the decade after the railroad arrived. New buildings appeared on Water Street. A second hotel opened. Small businesses established by local families offered goods and services the store had previously monopolized. The town was becoming a real commercial center rather than a company town in the formal sense. The diversity of enterprise was real. So was the fact that the bank holding the mortgages on most of the new buildings had one name on the door. Chapter 15. What Succession Preserved. Charles Schreiner did not build what he built to enjoy it alone. He built it to last. His sons entered the family enterprises with the same systematic thoroughness their father had applied to assembling them. Gus Schreiner took primary responsibility for the YO Ranch in the early 20th century, managing cattle and sheep operations on the consolidated land holdings with the same attention to stock records and water systems that had characterized the ranch under the senior Schreiner's oversight. Louis Schreiner worked the bank and mercantile operations. The transition from founder to second generation, which destroys many family enterprises, damaged nothing here. The institutional knowledge transferred. The ledger tradition continued. The YO Ranch entered the 20th century as one of the genuinely significant cattle operations in Texas. The acreage, over 600,000 acres at its peak, spread across Kerr, Kimball, Edwards, Menard, and Real counties, required a management structure that resembled a small company more than a family ranch. Foremen, ranch hands, fence crews, water tank maintenance men, veterinary staff during lambing and calving seasons. The payroll ran to dozens of employees year-round, more during roundups and shearing. The ranch was, by any measure, a working agricultural institution of real economic consequence. that it had been assembled through a credit system that stripped land from smaller operators did not make its subsequent operation less real or less productive. Both facts coexist. The Schreiner family's civic role deepened in the early 20th century in direct proportion to their economic dominance. The gift that established Schreiner Institute in 1923, the Presbyterian preparatory school that would eventually become Schreiner University, arrived at a moment when Charles Schreiner was 84 years old and had been the most powerful economic actor in Kerr County for more than 50 years. The gift was genuine. It was also, by that point in his life, the kind of philanthropic capstone that consolidates a legacy. The institution would carry his name. The community would associate that name with education and opportunity. The foreclosure mechanism that funded the gift would recede into the background of the county's self-understanding, gradually, then completely. This is not a cynical reading of the gift. Schreiner University has educated thousands of students over a century. Its presence in Kerrville is a concrete good. But the framing of philanthropy as evidence of character, used to crowd out examination of method, is a move so common in American economic history that it barely requires commentary. Carnegie libraries, Rockefeller universities, Vanderbilt hospitals, the pattern accumulate through methods the era's law permitted and its conscience might have questioned, then distribute in ways that generate gratitude and suppress inquiry. The gratitude is real. The suppression is also real. Charles Schreiner died in 1927, having never faced a significant legal challenge to his business methods. The credit system he built operated within the law as written, because he understood the law as written better than most of his customers did, and because the law as written in Gilded Age Texas was designed for exactly the kind of accumulation he practiced. He did not need to break rules. He wrote within them with enough precision that the rules served his purposes entirely. The Y.O. Ranch passed through the Schreiner family into the 20th century, shrinking gradually as land taxes, estate settlements, and market pressures worked against the concentration that the credit system had created. By the 1960s, it covered roughly 200,000 acres. By the 1980s, 40,000. Today, the core operation sits on about 40,000 acres near Mountain Home in Kerr County, a fraction of the peak. Still a substantial working ranch, still carrying the brand that Charles Schreiner registered in the 1870s on land that had belonged to other people. Epilogue. The ledger's last entry. The limestone building on Water Street is still there. The vault door that Charles Schreiner installed in 1895 has been preserved. The pressed tin ceiling reflects light the same way it did when ranchers came to discuss their accounts. The building has been repurposed several times, marked with plaques, photographed for heritage tourism materials. It is a handsome building. The craftsmanship holds. The Y.O. Ranch operates today as both a working cattle operation and a game ranch, offering hunting and wildlife experiences on land that once carried Schreiner's wool flocks. It employs workers. It pays taxes. It operates inside the economic structures of the modern hill country, which are no longer organized around one man's ledger. The monopoly dissolved long ago. Kerrville has other banks, other merchants, other sources of credit. The closed loop that Schreiner operated for 50 years opened when the railroad brought competition and banking regulation imposed transparency. What remains is the land distribution. The transfer of Kerr County land that occurred between 1870 and 1920 did not reverse when the system that produced it was superseded. Land, once transferred, stays transferred. The families that hold hill country acreage today hold it from transactions that began in Schreiner's ledger. The original owners and their descendants are elsewhere, or they are nowhere traceable. Charles Schreiner was not the only man who operated this way. Not uniquely villainous, not uniquely visionary. Unusually patient, perhaps, and unusually thorough, and unusually fortunate to have arrived in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right combination of capital, language, and knowledge. He built real things. A town's commercial infrastructure, a working ranch on difficult land, a university that educates students a century after his death. He was, by every available measure, a formidable and capable man who understood his world completely. He was also a man who built his fortune inside a system designed to transfer wealth from the many to the one, who operated that system deliberately and with full knowledge of its mechanics, and who left behind a commemorative landscape that celebrates the accumulation while carefully forgetting the transfer. The ledger recorded both sides of every transaction. The monuments record only one. That is not Schreiner's doing exactly. It is the doing of the people who built the monuments, the people who decided which facts belonged on plaques and which belonged in archives, the people who named a university and hung a portrait and wrote a history that began with a young immigrant's ambition and ended with a respected patriarch's philanthropic legacy, skipping cleanly over the 50 years of foreclosures in between. The ledger, if it still exists in its entirety, tells a different story, a complete story. Every name, every debt, every transfer, every acre, the full account of what it cost and who paid it to build the most powerful institution in Kerr County from a limestone building and an eye for other men's vulnerabilities. If you found this story worth knowing, share it with someone who should hear it. There are 100 Charles Schreiners buried under 100 historical markers in this country, and most of them have universities named after them, too.